We're going to do some unusual things tonight. Maybe not for all of humanity, but in general, my life is a journey of doing unusual things. And what I find is some of the most interesting fertility, the best opportunities, is when differences come together in a new arena. Is anyone familiar with that? Who's on a journey like that? So it's about breakthroughs. It's about moving out of a paradigm where maybe we're self-referential. Maybe we're in a rut. We've done things the same way over and over again, and we can't quite break out. So this mission here is about acknowledging the whole ecology that we live in. The planet, the laws of physics, all the parameters in which life on Earth function, and the human beings that live within those domains. How are we doing in acknowledging, honoring, mentoring the next generation to be in relationship with those ecological laws of physics? And if we're not doing well with that, how do we bring that awareness into the next generation? So the difference to bring to the equation might come from the margins, those who are marginalized, those who are deeply embedded in nature and have been for a long time, pushed to the margins. Maybe they have something to share with those who are at the center, not knowing exactly what they're doing. So it's a bit of poetic, overarching talk here about where we're going with this. I'm going to introduce myself in a minute, but I want to play a short minute and a half little video. And what's inspiring to me about this is it's put out by Conservation International. And it seems to me they're breaking the rules a little bit about their brand, about who they are as a business. And it just knocks down some walls for me to say, oh my gosh, this is not just about business or marketing. Something serious is going on. Are you ready? You want to watch this? Okay, so I need my tech guy here. You have to pay attention to the audio because it's just going to come out of this little laptop here. Mine works in a software company in California. He's a cloud computing expert. And his origins are from South America and Central America. And he grew up in a village. And he said, in El Salvador, it was, the houses were arranged in a village arrangement. My aunts and uncles were there. People played music. They shared food. And they shared work together. And during times of difficulty and stress, everything was in place for a resilient response. And somehow the culture was designed for that. It wasn't a culture of silos, which is a word that I learned later on from Hurricane Katrina. This term silo entered the vocabulary of the world for me. Anyone ever experienced that term, silos? It's meant to mean something, right? It describes what? What would you say? Yeah?
Something that goes high up but not broad.
Yeah, goes up and down but not broad. Isolation. What else do you associate with silos?
Fragmentation. There's no communication between people at the same level.
Right.
No interaction.
So it's vertical but not horizontal. Yeah. What were some of the other ones?
Fragmentation.
Say it again. Fragmentation. Yeah, because they're not interconnected that way. Yeah. Disconnection. Specialization. Yeah, exactly. Specialization. Differences. It's like Porky Pig. So there's a reason why things evolve that way, I think. But he said when I came to the United States and I was got involved in cloud computing in Silicon Valley and everything, what I noticed was that I got put into the engineer unit and I never connected with the marketing people or the sales people or the executives. And it was isolating and disconnecting. And he had an intuitive sense of that because of his origins. And he says, what I would like to see is bring yourself to work day. Not like bring your kids, but bring your whole self to work day. And allow all the differences to come together and have everybody connect with each other. So here we are at a workshop when I'm supposed to be speaking and you're supposed to be listening, but you're doing this lateral communication with each other. So if fire drill goes off, we're probably going to do much better than if we never had that paired chair. So I want to hear a little bit about, just from one or two people, why are you here? What's calling you this evening? What's calling you here this evening? Why would you come to a talk called, yes?
I'm curious about the new direction that your work is taking.
Great, thank you. Where do you think that is?
I think toward working with businesses and individuals.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah. One more thought about that. Yeah.
I'm curious what you can inspire me to where I want to go, because I'm not sure where that is yet.
Yeah, okay, good. And one more, okay.
I'm just so excited to think that there's actually hope for this world that we're living in. There's people doing really important work, and it's really refreshing. So
Yeah.
I'm happy to be here.
Good.
To learn more about that.
Great. Well, that's what I want, too. I want to inspire people to become their whole self. And a lot of it comes down to some pattern language. My background is as an artist, as a creative who went off trail. And there was definitely pathways for me around what I was supposed to do in life. And I ended up backing out of that whole system, thinking I was basically going to die when I dropped out of college, because there was no map at that point. I was so far off trail, there was no future for me. Has anyone crossed over a threshold like that? You have that feeling? Is there one coming for you? One of the things they say is, if you don't go through initiation, life will initiate you. So it happens one way or the other, and I think it happened to me. And it's not something I got to choose, but when I look back on it, it wasn't such a bad thing. It took me out of a determined future, a reductionist plan of a number of choices that I had to choose. And I think something in my deep self said, I don't fit the boxes, but I have no other option. So I just stopped participating until there were no more options. And a kind of death ensued, a deep change, off trail, out of college, learning to get my own food, rent my own apartment, get my own job, and figure out how am I going to proceed as an adult in this world without that path. Of course, it was a little disconnecting from my family of origin, who expected that of me, and that was a familiar path for people. So there was about 10 years of wondering, was Mark okay? Not sure he's doing all right. And I didn't know either. So there's a little tension on this journey at the beginning, and that's probably why a lot of people don't go, because you're not sure how it's going to turn out. But what opened up for me was a free exploration. Well, if my other option is death, then all of life is an option. And what I chose to do was pursue that which I was passionate about, that which had purpose and meaning for me, because death was my option at any time. If you've had a brush with death, or if you've known someone in your life who's died, I think you can have a sense for me of how refreshing that can be, like a brush. It's not necessarily a terrible thing. Death is a huge part of life, and I think that's why cultures around the world have huge ceremonies and rituals and organization around acknowledging it, grieving it, facilitating a relationship to it. And a culture that avoids death and avoids change and avoids the unknown gets backed into a corner of not a lot of options, because we have a lot of ways of avoiding that conversation. Anyone familiar with what I'm talking about? Not just literal death, like, you go to a funeral and you're not allowed to see the body, or you don't even go to the funeral, or you don't know what to say to someone. You don't know how to grieve. Not even that, but all the other implications of change. How do I evolve? Which is an important part of the conversation. I found myself going on a human journey of consciousness development, evolving out of what I thought was real and what I thought was my role in life to realizing there was a whole other arena to play in, which is, what is my purpose for being here? How do I make meaning out of the world? Because I grew up in a time where things were happening around me that I didn't understand and definitely had an impact on me. I grew up in a neighborhood that had fields and forests and places to play, and by the time I got to high school, it was all developed and gone. And then there were fences and sidewalks that led to the mall. Later on, I learned that's called economy and growth. But there was an externalization of something there that did not get accounted for. Which is what? You know, but not just nature. What about the childhood relationship to nature? Is it okay to externalize environmental cost in a business plan? Well, if financial value is the only value, then sure, at all costs, we'll make this profitable. And I think that has been part of the siloed world. Anyone see The Big Short? Raise your hand if you've seen The Big Short. Are you depressed? Pissed?
It wasn't inspiring.
Kind of like in a freaking me out way.
Yeah.
But you're right. Because it ends by saying this can happen again, basically.
What was The Big Short?
The Big Short is a movie about the 2008 recession, economic drop down, and how it was really fed by, you could say, a lack of empathy for humanity or blinders on the impact of siloing all of your effort into one location. Targeting minorities with really high mortgages that they could never afford. So when the whole thing collapsed and people couldn't sell their homes, the people who played the game and rigged the whole thing did not feel any of the consequences. It was the people all the way down at the bottom. So that's why we started hearing about the 1% and the 99% shortly after that, because that's where the money went, like a vacuum. So I have a concern, you know, I spent the last 20 years creating resilience in communities and families on the ground with real people, building real relationships. Because I knew from my own childhood, a compartmentalized, isolated child grows up to be not well. There's a saying that says, adjusting to an unwell world is no sign of health, which is what we do when we adapt. You know, if all roads lead to the mall and I learn to become a consumer, did I fulfill my childhood developmental needs? Is it okay to not have a childhood enriched with nature connection? Well, the research is in and they say it's not okay. There's actually 100 impacts. And surprisingly, we have to deliver that research day in, day out, day in, day out, day in, day out, to keep making these correlations between obesity and ADHD and violence and all sorts of disorders, addiction. It's all correlated to a lack of connection. In fact, there's this famous rat experiment. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? I just read this the other day, which is crazy disturbing. And it had to do with heroin and morphine and the addiction with drugs. And what they found out was, you know, that if you put water in a container in a tiny little cage with a rat and then one filled with, is it heroin or morphine? Something highly addictive, right? And that.
Heroin and cocaine.
Heroin and cocaine. So the rat, you know, chooses between the two, and in this tiny little cage, the rat eventually just keeps going back to the heroin cocaine bottle. And so, you know, research check, that's what addiction is all about. It's about this drug. But then there was some tension in the background because there are actually a lot of hospital patients that use those as painkillers, and they leave and they're not addicted to the painkillers. There's actually enough data to create cognitive dissonance of that. So, and then there's the war on drugs, and there's all this around that that's influencing our mind around addiction. So you put people in jail, you know, and you put all this money around keeping people off of drugs. But somebody did another experiment where they created how did they describe the second rat environment? It was like a rat utopia. So what do rats like to do as animals, as biological species? What do you think? Chew. What else? Run around. Have sex. Climb. Right? All the things that, rats actually come from something. They come from a natural world, a natural environment. They do things. Not just like in the alleys. There's natural rats out there. Do you know? We could change your mind and think of a duck. And if you put a duck in a cage, and the cage was a little bit larger than the duck, and you gave it the water and the cocaine, it probably would have the same result. Ducks don't live in cages, right? Rats don't live in cages either. Rats have a whole life. It'd be like putting a monkey in a cage. Monkeys don't live in cages. They have a whole life. Their whole biology is built on the environment they were born in, that they co-evolved with. So what they found out is if the larger they made this cage with more ratness in it that they co-evolved with, they actually did not prefer the morphine cocaine mixture. They just drank the water. What does that tell you?
Rats are smart.
No. That's not the exact...
Because he wasn't happy.
Say it again?
The rat was self-medicating in his cage.
So it's almost starting to sound like a parable instead of research. Because let's go back to the silos distinction. How many of us exist in silos in our culture today? Create the definition any way you want. Who lives in a silo in one form or another? Okay. Here's another quiz. How many people knew their neighbors growing up as a kid? How many of them know them today? Just as many as when you were a kid? Wow, okay. Most of the time it's like a 10-to-1 drop. How many people knew or had grandparents living with them when they were a kid? Okay, and how many of that do you see today? So there are patterns and trends around the collective becoming more and more what they would say is like reductionist, because it's more efficient. More efficient. And we're applying efficiency in silos to human beings. And we did not co-evolve to live in cages or silos or compartments. We co-evolved to commune. And commune where? In nature. So we're like an experiment. We're actually in a cage right now. It's called a building. And if we go from this cage down the hallway, through the little gap in nature to the car, and then home to the driveway, and then that little gap, and then into the house, and then do our work, and sometimes we're on screens, and then back to the car, and back to the building, and we do that 80 hours a week, 125 hours a week, and we map that against 100,000 years of our human heritage that we co-evolved with. We're pretty much like the rats in the cage. What do we have to survive that experience? What's our choice? Water. Are we okay with water? Or do we self-medicate in a variety of ways? Drinking. What's that?
Pretty socially acceptable.
Yep, totally. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's a whole paradigm around this. For example, entertainment. Do we make the entertainment? Are we learning instruments because everyone in our home is learning instruments, and we walk across the street and we have a mentor who's teaching us how to play guitar, and there's a band that forms on the block, and they shut the cars down, and there's a huge concert every week because everyone on the block's learning instruments, and someone says, hey, let's put together a 10-part string band, and it happens in like 5 days. Just as an example. Is that happening? How about brass bands? Are those happening in your neighborhoods? There's no noise ordinance because you're all in the band. Is that happening? Right? No, but there's certainly Disney Channel, and there's certainly stuff coming through on your computer. There's an endless stream of entertainment opportunities that goes to someone else's pocket, right? There's some fee associated usually. So the question is, how do we recognize, A, that that's happening and correlate the lack of connection with the ills that we're having? Because raise your hand if you think we're doing great as a society. We have a net surplus of connection and wellness. So that's a pretty startling poll. Overall, there are some trends within that complexity. And we're definitely in a more complex age than ever, notably, right? But there are some trends that are indicator species for me that have a story behind them. So one would be how our children are doing in this part of the world, North America, and the rise of, let's say, obesity. What is that about? And when you backtrack it, and the people who are researching it, comes down to where their food comes from and where their relationship to their body comes from and how much time they're spending on screens and how much time are they spending outside playing. And all the data keeps showing that we're actually creating that. It's not like a mystery, but it kind of shows up like, hey, we better do some research. Our children are becoming extremely obese more than ever. Do some research, quick, more research. And then maybe pass a policy, maybe. But in school, they'll cut out gym, and they'll cut out art, and they'll cut out music. They'll cut out all these connective type activities so that we can get smarter, right, or have longer school days. And there's all this other pushback going on of inventing alternative schools and inventing other ways of education. So we're in this turbulent time of perhaps a zenith of the greatest disconnection we've been in as human beings. And you can see it in the edges are crumbling. Could be the economy that you look at. Whole countries collapsing economically. And they say that it crumbles at the edges and starts moving towards the core. How are we going to prepare for an unsustainable world? One of the indicators for me, people are talking to me about sustainability. Well, maybe your work, Mark, is addressed in the sustainability world. And so I got involved with an organization that's working on sustainability and limits to footprints, carbon footprints and impact in the environment, and getting corporations to measure their externalization of environmental costs and social justice issues. And it's a fascinating journey. And what I'm finding is very few multinational corporations are actually measuring that or have a sustainability program. And of those that do, it's something like 10% out of the 80,000 multinational corporations. And of the 10%, there's 400 different measures. So it's apples to oranges to bananas to grapefruit. So as an investor, they could say, we're doing 10% better this year in our sustainability report and make a big report about it. 10% what? Better than what? Well, we killed 100 people last year, and this year we're only killing 90. Because that's essentially what they're measuring. It's less bad. Less bad pollution, less bad social justice, less bad leaving chemical toxins in the environment, all the different measures that you might have. Less land loss in the Amazon. But very few are actually at zero, and maybe none, of zero impact on a big scale. There are some tiny organizations that are amazing. Like there's one in Toronto called Chocosol. So Chocosol is like a vision for the future. And the question is, how can we bring that consciousness to larger organizations? And I think it's going to happen through this kind of conversation, this kind of training. But essentially, they're working on not only net zero impact, but net positive impact. How do we generate a surplus in our business paradigm? And what I see right away is they look at value totally differently. It's not just financial value. It's also social capital and natural capital. They're bringing cacao beans from Central America, from a Mayan origin, right? So there's an extraction going on, but they ship it by boat as slow as they can. So it's as efficient as they could. And then they bicycle it from the pier, and they grind it with a bicycle. And they distribute it by bicycle. That's a pretty intense commitment to low carbon. But down there, the cacao plants are interwoven with the forest ecosystem. So it's not like they grow a crop of it. So if the value of cacao goes up, the tending of the forest goes up. The employment of the people learning how to tend a forest garden goes up. And the intergenerational mentoring continues. and there's awareness and consciousness of that process. The people who come to be employed at Chocosal are actually part of an educational paradigm where there's mentoring going on in the organization. So there's a surplus going on between the employer and the employee, because it's almost like going to school, but they're getting paid to be there because they're learning about ecological ways of running a business. That's amazing. So that's really different than a siloed organization trying to get the most out of their cacao bean and selling it in a different place. And it's courageous because there's probably a reduction in financial profit, but there's a greater resilience horizontally. Think about all those people coming in and out of that organization with that young consciousness. So the journey that I want to talk a little bit about is how do we move to a world that's not just doing less bad, but we are thinking about how to be regenerative. Pull the conversation way out here to our actions have a net surplus. And it puts a lot of things in question. So if you look at the measures of the ecological limits on the planet, there are 9 limits that have been established for humanity. Things like phosphorus and nitrogen and ocean stocks and climate change and land use. And there are these red limits to survival for humanity, basically, on a global level. So there's the big measurement. How's the whole human family doing in our house, the one we can't get out of? And we have surpassed 4 of the 9. Like the house is, 40% of the house is burning down. And we're hanging out over here like on the Titanic. So it's intense for me. And so when I see Conservation International putting out this film, I'm thinking, they're aware of this. How are we going to reach people? Is it more statistics? Is it more research? It's this compassionate lens of like, you know what? I love you people, but you know what? You may be the ones to go and we'll carry on here. You know, biodiversity lost is so far beyond the red zone, it's 3 times higher than their chart. It's just off the chart, biodiversity loss. So, you know, if we could be as radical as the situation is, we would basically take a moment, at least once a year, once a month, and we would get together and we would think tank, what can we do differently? Like wipe the slate clean around money, around energy, around food, and around this idea of creating resilience amongst each other. The background that I come from, when I went off trail, I had a lot of these questions for myself. You know, I wanted to know, how could I establish nature connection for children to the deepest level possible, because I saw it disappear for me. And it led me on this road. And what I found is it quickly led me to the mentors and the masters of nature connection, which is the cultures that have lived closest to the earth and still exist today. Lineages of masterful cultural models of nature connection, because they had to or they would die. All these sophisticated cultural elements that provoke deep connection, but not just with nature, with each other as well, and with themselves inside. And this is what I'm talking about that has been pushed to the margins, because, you know, we don't need that anymore. But in Canada, it's a really incredible time because of this truth and reconciliation that's going on. There's an acknowledgement happening, right? So what's the possibility of bringing that knowledge and that wisdom out of that context into every context that we have? What would that be like? So, for example, this is an amazing book right here that really brings the two together. It's called Original Instructions, Indigenous Teachings for a Sustainable Future. Like, this could be a textbook. And there's a writing in here by John Mohawk, who is part of the Haudenosaunee. And he has a very powerful statement in here that has super inspired me, because I have a mission to inspire the siloed world to take some risks, to become more complex and more interconnected, so that we can have a more resilient future. Where is this quote? So the title of this piece is called Culture Change, Climate Change, and the Future of Civilization. And from this indigenous perspective, he says, you know, we've been around for a long, long time. We've even experienced climate change before in our long oral history. The first paragraph kind of says it all. It says, the most foolish thing that the United States government has ever done was to launch a centuries-long campaign to eradicate indigenous cultures. A great deal of profound knowledge and wisdom we could desperately use today, was lost. Diversity. There's strength in our diversity, right? And there's weakness in our siloedness. There's efficiency, but we're not meant to be that efficient to the point of extinction. The last paragraph ties it together. He says, that's why I say the stupidest thing the colonists and their governments ever did was to suppress Indian culture. Because guess what? Climate change is coming again, and those cultures had a lot of very practical knowledge about how to adjust and survive in the face of major climate change. This is an incredible moment in history. We're right on this edge of bringing those things together. And I think there will be some things that inspire us to accept and embrace the difference. One of those is these cultural elements that help us relate to the unknown. So for example, in a human development journey, one of the things that is common around the world in cultures that live close to the earth is this adolescent passage called initiation. Has anyone ever heard of a rite of passage or initiation? And I don't mean like fraternity initiation, but it's a, you know, that's kind of a modern version of a threshold into an organization. But I mean on the developmental level of going from childhood to not quite adulthood, but the early stages of forming how do I conduct myself in my society. And it sounds like something that's totally irrelevant to our modern day world. But when we paint this picture of where we are today, I think it's one of the most high leverage things that we could reincorporate back into our child rearing, our educational system, and even our business environments. Because what happens is the culture comes together and says, this person is starting to show changes, not just hormonal ones, but ones in which they have the power to do something outside the family unit. And they're going, right? So they come in and say, okay, time to enculturate resilient values. What are the norms of our society? And what are the ones that we've known from the elders and the elders before that that creates a nice long arc of resilience? What are the teachings they need to know? What are the stories and maps they need to listen to? Because some of it is tradition, but others is give them general maps so they can innovate as the changes come. What are the maps? What are the stories? How do I listen to the world and be present so that I can be aware and adaptable? So in those initiatory experiences, there is all of this training and development going on, but there's also a psychological change. Ego development is essential. And what happens with initiatory experiences is it also introduces that there are others that are part of our world that we are interdependent with. So you could say the I goes out on their initiatory experience and the we comes back. And understanding that I'm not the only thing in existence here. So a mature adult would operate from that place. What's good for you is good for me. That's how I've been taught. That's how I conduct myself from a very young age. That would be a regenerative process, something that leaves a surplus of connection ability starting really young. And that's where I started, because I thought, if I have to choose anywhere in this culture and to make culture change, the adults seem baked based on past patterns. So I'm going to start all the way as young as I can and introduce and incorporate and establish cultural mentoring patterns like initiation and nature connection. as well as elders and intergenerational mentoring, aunts and uncles, celebrations, festivals, belonging to place, awareness of the four directions, storytelling, and mastery of their place in terms of survival. And see if we can reintroduce our children to the awareness and competency of our ancestors. That was my game. That was my moonshot goal. And what was fascinating about it is all sorts of profound development happened with this youth. I also trained adults to mentor youth in this way. And so it was a stacked environment of a lot of people who were learning with the open-ended question, And what I started to see is that as they went into young adulthood, this was 20 years ago that I started this, they're now out there fostering new paths and forging a lot of these connections that have never been made before out of maybe a more silo traditional education. They're broad thinkers. They're inspired learners. They know how to move in the world and build relationships. I remember a story about one of these youth who had a long time learning about bird language and tracking animals and sitting in the forest and a lot of our awareness activities, and a very artistic soul, really just stayed open instead of closing down. He just was almost like his original instructions were just stayed connected. And eventually he decided he wanted to go to college, and he went to community school and he worked out all these things, and he decided he would go to Cornell. And he got in on a scholarship and went into landscape architecture. And as he was looking around the school and being in that place, there was a particular teacher that attracted his attention because of the way he led the class, not the content he was teaching. And so he watched him for a while and listened to his stories, and he learned about him. He realized that he had some native roots. And he's like, oh, maybe that's why it's familiar to me. I'm curious to learn from this person. And he had history in agriculture, but like food forest agriculture, learning how to grow perennial crops through trees and through polycultures in a forest system, which is more complex than a monoculture agriculture. And that he said, that's intriguing to me. That makes sense to me. I want to follow that. And so in his nature awareness experience that was happening all the time, he discovered a persimmon tree on the property. And they were ripe at that time of year. And he hadn't seen any other persimmon trees. And it was one that was growing in an odd place. It wasn't planted. So he went and he harvested some of these persimmons and he put them in his pocket. And he found out that the way he did office meetings with this guy is you walked around the pond with him. So that was his office hour. So he signed up for one of these office hours, and he walked around the pond with him, and he pulled the persimmons out of his pocket, and he shared them with the professor. And as a food forest, polyculture guy, he looked at this and he thought, how did he find these? Think about the average college kid who's on campus. What is he doing on Friday night, and where is he coming from? Like this, how did he see this? How did he know they were ripe? How did he know to give them to me? And it was just this silent transaction, this silent relationship moment of, I see you. And it meant more than words could say, and he was a quiet guy, They went on to build a powerful relationship, and one filled with storytelling and teachings and mentoring, almost like the youth was a magnet for those kinds of people in his life because of the childhood that he had with me. And other stories, my adopted niece Mariah, she was a very powerful, young, spunky girl, and she knew that initiation was a possibility. So I was putting together solo experiences, nature experiences for boys and girls, and she says, I want to do that. I said, okay, well, I don't have one for your school. You'd have to organize that and bring people up here. And she says, okay, click. And she calls me back a week later, okay, I've got 5 kids and a driver. And she's 13. I'm like, oh, okay, all right. So I said, well, come during my summer camp and I'll set up a special thing just for you. And so she shows up with her friends and the drivers who are, she's telling them what to do, how to get there, They're like, I don't know what this is. And we put them out on a 24-hour solo. And in the beginning, we spend time dropping them into the natural environment, and then we say it's important before you go that you have an intention. What is your purpose for being on this journey? So that they can start to cultivate this ability to put forth a high ideal before they go into an unknown experience. In some ways, that is their rope of resilience. It is the thing that pulls them through that unknown, being able to cultivate an intention. So we spend time on that, and then off they go, and we blindfold them, and we put them in a place in the woods, and they have a number of survival activities they can do there. But the overall message is I have a challenge to be with myself in this wide world. How do I cope with this? How do I adjust myself to this situation? What am I made of? And we like to say, what am I already made of? And in that, they find it. And whatever they get from that experience is theirs. Can't be, spoon-fed to them or taken away from them. It's totally theirs. And so when they come back, we have this tradition of telling the story of their experience and asking them these questions about, what did you learn about yourself? Tell me about your intention. What happened when you got into a hard spot? How did you rise to meet that challenge? And if you were to name that as a general teaching for yourself, what would that be called? That when I trust and let go, I know that I'll be taken care of. 13 years old. And so I say, that could be useful in your life probably, right? You might want to write that down. In fact, you might want to create an art piece around that. Make some regalia. Make a necklace and wear that. Tell the story to your community and family when you get home. I'll tell you how to set up one of those sharings. So people hear the story of this person who's gone on this quest, and her identity becomes tied to nature, tied to her community, and tied to a mythic adventure of purpose. She ended up getting a scholarship to Hampshire College in Massachusetts, and she didn't like it because her peers in 9th grade didn't have a lot of these experiences. And she had this kind of bad realization. She's like, they're like 3rd graders. They're afraid to go outside. They're screaming all the time. No one can really listen to each other. It's like they've never done anything. I go, well, sorry to inform you, but you've had a lot of privileges in your life. And these experiences are going to probably for a long time put you in situations where you have something deep to draw on when other people don't. And you're going to have to make meaning out of that for yourself because it's unusual that you got a chance to do these things. So you're on a path of leadership. You're on a path of establishing culture for other people so they can have those experiences. And she kicked the ground. She wasn't happy with that. And eventually she dropped out of school, and she spent the rest of her year working in the community, helping children, because she thought that was much more where her heart was. And she moved to Hawaii. And I introduced her to a friend of mine over there, because I said, if you're going to Hawaii, you should probably meet my friend Kalani. And so she says, okay, what should I do? Make sure you bring him a gift, because he's traditional, and you always want to give before you take. She said, I know you always tell me that. I go, but make sure you bring him a gift and listen, and be respectful. She's like, I know you always tell me that. So she does. She does this whole process, and I don't hear from her, and I just kind of get a phone call back, a bunch of weeks later. Tells me the whole story. So we continue our relationship over the years through meeting a man, through having children, through getting her degree, through Prescott College, in working with adolescents and initiatory rites. I don't even know if she's tracked the whole story like I have, honestly. I think she's just doing her life, really. But because I'm in her life, every once in a while I can kind of pull out the, when you were 13, you remember that solo you did? She goes, that was crazy. Yeah, but you remember what you said before you went? No. So I can be this mirror for her, like a soul reflection. How powerful would that be if we all could have that kind of long-term mentoring relationship that could give us a soul reflection of who we are and what our purpose is? That kind of thing is horizontal, right? It's ways in which we could do that for each other all the time. So she started learning from him, this traditional man, and his wife, Julie, and other grandmothers, and eventually, because she's Colombian, they thought she was Hawaiian, partially because of the color of her skin, but also because of the way she conducted herself. She acted more like Hawaiians than a lot of the people who were there in her environment. It was in her bones. And because of that, relationships opened for her. And again, it was like a magnet of learning about the world and learning about what it is to be a human being. So she's on a special journey. And I tell her story just because I think we could all be on that journey. We could all start right where we're at and start moving towards the map of being on a regenerative human journey. And there's some tools that I've learned to language through the 8 Shields with John Young and the Art of Mentoring. So one category is called the 6 to 4 cultural elements. And cultural elements are a lot of the things that I've been mentioning. So, for example, elders and elder wisdom, initiation, sensory awareness to place, even greeting customs. Now, it doesn't have to be a specific greeting custom. Like I don't need to imitate a Maori greeting custom to get greeting custom in my life. In fact, it's better if we just think of these things as rootstock and we graft onto that rootstock our own local cultural wisdom that makes sense. So a greeting custom, for example, is like the persimmon thing. You know, it's something that's really going to message to the person that I'm with that I'm paying attention to, you're important, or a welcome of some kind. The territorial acknowledgement is a greeting custom. It has a purpose and intent behind it. It's actually mentoring us. There was a time before we didn't do territorial acknowledgements, right? Now we do. And if we did them long enough, children would be raised in this environment and they'll think that's the way it always was. What else can we do like that? So a greeting custom is really designed for establishing connection. And I found it to be extremely effective, not just in raising children, but also in creating resilience in communities. Because in my experience, growing up in the communities that I worked with, silos exist there too because of outside forces. A lot of them economic or governmental or even in housing development design, where our food comes from. Anyone experience what I'm talking about? So a greeting custom in a community slows that process down, and I take the time to find out who I'm with in a gathering like this, or as people come into my home, or the grocery store. You're no longer a transaction for me once I have the idea of greeting custom in my life. Has anyone been a checkout person at a supermarket? Yeah? You know what it's like to be there all day long with people just ching, 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 and maybe not making eye contact with you, and you become part of the checking machine? There are some places that would be totally unacceptable. But it's gotten to be a norm, right? So it's like, hello, hi, how's it going, human being? I was in a startup company 2 days ago. It's a tech startup company, and they're doing a really interesting thing of creating fish tanks and complex ecology with all these little fish in there and fish waste. And then they filter out all that nutrients and they put it into a grow bed, and you grow indoor plants under fluorescent lighting. So you can have this ecological grow system in your house. And I thought, huh, that's pretty cool. And their selling point was grow your own food indoors. And I'm like, okay, you know, it's a lot expensive and it's super high tech, but these were 24-year-old MIT students. But what I saw kind of through the initial where they're at story is these are people who care about the interrelationship of all things through their gift of science and how they got to MIT. So I said, wow, you know, this is really awesome. You know what I think about a lot? I think about raising children to be systems thinkers, to recognize silos and opportunities for interconnection. Where are the high leverage points in a system to create change? How could we take that out of the PhD realm and bring it all the way down to elementary school so that they're actually ecological thinkers, that they tend to see the interrelationship of all things? What is the system here? What's the system of oppression? What's the system of regenerative connection so there's a surplus in the room? What's the difference between mentoring and adopting someone for a long period of time or teaching or education that's more factory-like? What's the impact of efficiency and silos versus multi-capitals and spreading things horizontally? Systems thinkers are, you know, they have awareness of that, but it takes practice, it takes experience. So I said, you know, you could actually bring this into classrooms and kids could build this ecology up from zero, and you could introduce them to the interrelationships of the fish, the nutrients, the plants, and you could do the whole thing through the art of questioning. And their minds are just like, oh my God, this is a whole other thing. It was really awesome. So, I was going to tell you a greeting custom story. So when they're in there, they're kind of engineering-like. Anyone here an engineer? Okay. Can I poke fun at engineers a little bit? So engineers are specialists, right? And you know, they tend to come with certain kinds of personalities and personas, and sometimes they're like kind of like focused on their work, right? And maybe on their computer or, another engineer was telling me this today, that's like these common traits, a little dry maybe. And so we got to this point where the two founders of this startup were walking me around, introducing me to people, and we got to the computer zone, and people were all working away, big open kind of coworker space. And they were a little awkward too, being engineers, so they just kind of like weren't sure if they were to introduce me, you know, and there was like 2 computer rows and then the people over there, they didn't kind of set the thing up and people didn't get up. And so I was kind of like standing there like, these are our people and these are our machines, you know, and this is the tech area, and over there was the biological plant area. And then one person catches her eye and she's like, hi, and he's like, oh, well, Judy, this is Mark, you know, he's helping us with our company. And she's like, oh, hi. You know, we reach across the computers and we say hello, and then she sits down, and there's like 5 other people there, but it kind of like, it's like the slow domino that falls. And then another person kind of catches the movement and stands up and slowly reaches over the computers and we say hello again, like, we shake hands, okay, shake hands, okay, and then we got to go through this whole thing, and then the fourth person in a row was the guy plugged in and on the monitor. This has been going on for like a long 7 minutes, this slow domino greeting custom, you know. I'm like, okay, you know, here we go. It was kind of fun and kind of awkward, and so they're like, well, we should probably finish and get all the people to say hello because that's what we're doing now. So he's like, Steve, you know, Steve, and he's like this, and I thinking we're going to greet each other. He's like, who are you? and I thought, oh my God, like he's either joking or like I don't know what. So out of my mouth comes human being, live human being. And I was like, oops, he wasn't joking. I think he's just trying to process, like, is this an important person? Like, do I have to say hello or like, what is this, you know? So he's like, hi, you know, back in the computer again, no? I was like, oh. This guy could use playing outside a little bit. He's been really over-harvested for his gifts, you know? But that's just how it is, you know? You get all these really cool connection tools in your belt, and they tend to be like seeing the Matrix in 3D, if you've seen that movie. And so they're really stoked. So the application, moving out of communities, is basically understanding that the economic world is something that we're all impacted by, but they're not always operating in an ecological manner, and they're not always operating in a human connection manner. So if we look at kind of the nested circles of our reality, this is, you know, individuals, This might be, you know, family unit, community, and then we have, you know, the business environment, which is a complex one, which can include organizations, nonprofits, social entrepreneurships, but, you know, the larger economic world. And that whole thing is nested in the domain of nature and the laws of physics in there. So to the degree that this world is unaware of the container they're actually in, has this double negative about it. It can silo and hyper-compartmentalize this resource as well as this one, and externalizing those costs, and highly concentrating that into something called financial capital. And from a systems thinking perspective, that's entropy. It's entropic. It's highly concentrating. And my friend Tom Wessels, who's a systems thinker and amazing biologist, says that human beings are the only species that are entropic. You know, the way we tend to concentrate like that. And, you know, if you think about it, it's kind of the opposite of diversity. It sets us up for not having a diverse amount of response. So if you have 5 major media companies and they operate 350 media outlets, who can control the elections? As if, you know, all those things are different, but they're really not. Or, I don't know, 5 multinational food corporations that own 350 brands. Or 5 banks that, you know, influence the world's money. Or, you know, the top 0.1% having 40% of all the income. It's just dangerous. It's just not the way I would want to run the world. So we want to find intervention points in the system to create change. And so this was the one I've been working on here, self, working with individuals to bring their whole self to work, bring their whole self to life through cultural mentoring elements like initiation and mentoring and nature connection. And then they go on to join the world, bringing their whole self into it and influencing it in that really amazing way. And also working at the family and community level. You know, there's a lot of examples of how communities can establish a lot of horizontal relationship just 'cause. And even FEMA has recognized this from this is an American, you guys know what FEMA is? So they were really disturbed by Hurricane Katrina and the response on the ground. Because when all that communication got shut down, nobody could communicate all the way up the silo anymore. But there was lots of resources there. They couldn't communicate with each other, or they didn't know how, or they didn't have experience of it. They were just strangers. And it was chaos. And it was embarrassing. And so there was a lot of orders around, figure out what happened there and fix it. You know, and of course what got unraveled was like, we have a systematic issue. Our whole world is siloed. It's a bigger problem than just fixing this. So they said, well, is there any other hurricane about the size of Hurricane Katrina where we didn't have that response on the ground? And they're also thinking, as climate scientists, that we're going to have more of these storms because of the warming of the Gulf waters. Like the prediction is it's going to continue. So they found that there was one called Hurricane Iniki in the Hawaiian Islands, and specifically hit the island of Kauai. And when they did the analysis, they looked back on the records and they saw that there was so much interrelationship on the island in terms of cultural practice over time. They had this proactive mechanism for responding to impact and disaster. So when, you know, 9 days later they finally came with resources, they didn't need any. That when people were split up from their families and couldn't get home from school or roads were out, they all just took care of the people they were with. They were used to taking care of themselves. They were used to the stories and lineage of storms in the past and where to go and what to do. And they had enlivening enrichment customs to survive difficult situations. So that might have been ceremony or singing or helping each other out in times of drought or famine.
What was that hurricane called?
Iniki.
And where was it?
Kauai. I find that inspiring. You know, again, it's like this comparison of, I think it's not that far back for us. It's very familiar once you start engaging in it. You know, I introduce people to nature all the time, and sometimes it's a non-starter. It's like, I don't want to go off the trail. Like, am I going to get dirty? You know, is this going to be uncomfortable? And once we get 10 steps into it, there's a relaxation and a familiarity. Probably because they were kids at some point, or at some point it was natural, and they're happy about it. But the issue is if they go home, back into the cultural environment that they co-evolved with, the rat cage or the silo or the lack of cultural customs of connection, that environment will influence them back into that place of forgetting the importance of that. So we have this issue here. If you go home with anything, go home with this image. These two things have historically co-evolved with each other, which seems obvious, right? That human people living close to nature developed culture that helped them live close to nature. You know, there's stories of anthropologists following tribes around and how they practice their customs and celebrations. And there's one image that really spoke to me around a ceremony they did every year. And part of what they did is they liked to feast as part of their annual practice. And feasting came with a lot of reverence and a lot of protocol and a lot of storytelling and remembering why we're here as people. It had all of these other benefits besides just eating lots of food. It just stops everything in its tracks. All the regular economic activity is on pause. And everyone reboots who they are and why we're here and what's important in the teachings of all these different things. And they're going to gather fish. So they go, they prepare themselves and they go on this walk to get the fish. And they cross over a river with perfectly good fish in it, you know, and go past the next one, and they go past the next one. And they've gone past 7 significant rivers until they get to the 7th one, and they use a plant-based poison that temporarily knocks out the fish, and they can, you know, through their ceremonial reverence, harvest these fish. And then they bring them back, and they prepare the whole thing, and give prayers and dance and have thanks and just like shake off the road dust, shake off the things that maybe had coagulated in them and come back to who they are, fully alive, fully present. It's an amazing thing, right? So he said, well, why didn't you stop at the first river, you know, or the second river or the third river? Like, you walked all day for that. It seems really inefficient. And he said, well, 7 years ago, we were at that first river. And 6 years the other one, and 5 years the other one, and 4 years the other one. So we rotate those so that these fish can continue to live. You know, that wasn't an educational system that taught them that. It was long-term oral history and nature connection. This is how we live here. We co-evolve with this place. Our culture is in relationship with the ecological limits of nature. Like, they didn't speak like that. It's just what we know. I think we can retrain that, you know? I think we can retrain that through our, if that is the priority of our raising our children in our educational system, primarily, we'll build businesses with the energy that we have, the resources that we have, within the limits that we have, serving the human needs that we have. What are our human needs anyway? What is the point of business in a regenerative world? What is its purpose? Who does it serve? You know, we have to have goods and services and trade. We have to have livelihoods, self-expression. But if we remember the domain that we're in and the origins of our humanity, that diversity equals strength, we can design for that. So in here, the danger in this map is when somewhere along the way, nature becomes an option, and we can just cycle back around to referencing culture again. Kind of like, this is like, you know, I'm too smart for my own good or something. I'm like, we did that, I'm good with that, I'm smarter than that, we can just manage that and just not actually take the time to engage with it as much anymore because we're modern. Right? We'll even externalize the people who are closest to nature as well, because that's a problem. I want to go in there and harvest timber, but there's people living there. So let's put them on a reservation, put them in a cage, and then harvest the timber. That's called, you know, conservation today. There's a lot of issues with not understanding this cycle. So The other really profound set of material that we can put into this pattern is introducing individuals at the business level, but also organizations. And there is a set of core routines of awareness that create powerful conditions for connection. And when you create conditions of connection, it sets up an awareness of emergence. And the reason why we want to set up conditions for emergence is because that's where we get something new to happen. Something that wants to happen instead of determining how things are supposed to go. Let's see if I can find that Margaret Wheatley quote. If you don't know Margaret Wheatley, this is a good author to read into here. Wheatley? Yeah. So I know of many people doing change work who are consciously using emergence as their theory of change. They work from an emergent design rather than a strategic plan. Because if we have a need, like this is the old Einstein quote, we can't change the world we're in by the framework that created it, right? It's too self-referential, kind of like this one. Oh, we've got a problem here. Let's bring some technology to the solution or something. There's an out-of-the-box solution here, which actually has its own wisdom location, which is actually our original location. It has all of these benefits to it, but we have to design for that. There's a commitment to it. So as things enter into a system, emergence is what naturally happens when things want to seek complexity in the system as opposed to entropy. So they work from an emergent design rather than a strategic plan, meaning they have a clear intent and they take the first actions, but then they see what's needed next. Working this way requires a great deal of awareness, constantly curious to see how the larger system is interacting with our project. Who's connecting with that thought? You rate what I'm saying? It's being really present to what the innovation is, for what purpose, and allowing it to come into being. There's a lot of working conditions where that's not the status quo. How many working conditions are you in where that's not the status quo? Do you know what I'm talking about? Where you don't necessarily want all that innovation or open-ended restructuring all the time. We want to set the thing in motion so we have a determined result. So this is risky. This is risky business. But just moving in that direction allows for a kind of competitive advantage because I'm evolving what the needs are. I'm evolving with what the needs are through awareness. So for example, if we look at investors, one of the other interesting groups of people who are interested in connected leadership right now are people moving from Wall Street to Main Street. So this is not a group of people I would go seek to do nature connection with, but they're finding me out through a kind of emergence that's happening. I've had 3 conversations in the last week about this. I'm like, okay, I wonder what this is about. So I start interviewing them. Why, what was it like on Wall Street amassing wealth that you were a part of? He's like, it's sick. It's toxic. If I didn't leave, I was watching people have heart attacks and jump off buildings. It's intense. It's cutthroat. I couldn't wait to get out of there. I'm miserable. One group of people through this chaplain that I know quietly is in this wealthy neighborhood in Connecticut doing spiritual counseling with them, with people who are so depressed and close to suicide because they have all the money in the world and they're spiritually miserable. That's his local environment. That's what he's dealing with. But it's an interesting emergence, isn't it? And what happened was the chaplain talked to this guy who's a financial advisor who quietly does meditation and some spiritual activities on the side. Doesn't reveal it all, but he's kind of got an eye out. And he hears about this problem and he says, you know what, I was just on a phone call about rites of passage with this guy, Morey, because my son is 13 years old. What if these guys, what they need is an initiation? And so we built a relationship with this chaplain And sometime this spring, we're actually going to put together this event of basically bringing them through the developmental stages that they might have missed. Things that increase belonging and the fullness of who they are. They're not a siloed human being. How to develop relationships, emotional capacity, philanthropy, spreading what they have horizontally through the joy of seeing something foster a regenerative world. Who knows? But it's a cool thing because all I have to do is create core routines of awareness with them. I'm not telling them what to do. I just know how human beings are at the core. Core routines of connection, and then drop them into nature awareness experiences and ask them questions like Mariah. They will come out with their own sense of wisdom about what their purpose is and what they're supposed to be doing here on the planet. And you know what? They'll be happy because they'll have meaning in their life. That's like a spiritual journey, right? But it's kind of simple. So the key to this is that if you're really good, she says, we take in as much feedback as possible and use it to figure out what to do next. So learning how to engage with others. So if you're setting up a team, how many people work on teams? Awesome. So if you're setting up a team, one of the things you want to do to create a resilient system, this is from Tom Wessels, the ecologist, biologist. I'm going into Google in February, and this is something we're going to experiment with, which is another emergent thing that I didn't plan on. What's cool about Tom Wessels is he's an elder now, total scientist. But in his slow journey of being in nature a lot, kind of in a mystic way, came out with a kind of wisdom that he said, I think what I'm learning through all of my research and nature time, a lot of applied ecology he does, I think I have a message for people living in community today. Because I see the systems that we're living in are not in alignment with nature and how nature ecology works. So he started doing these systems thinking ecology lectures free in these community rooms in Dummerston where I live. I live near him, luckily. And I went to every one of them like, you are blowing my mind. This is incredible. He just takes all of this years of wisdom and he distills it down to these simple models. He says, what if we operated our community like that? What if we set up our businesses so that there was a lot of options for surface area and structure and opportunity to navigate around and emerge co-working together and to innovate ideas and to, at any point in the system, someone can introduce something that people are valued. He says, one company I really like, I've been studying businesses a little bit like this, is Badger Bomb, and the founder is an unusual man. And I interviewed this guy, and it turns out he had some nature mentoring instructions somewhere along the way, including doing sweat lodges. And so he's a curious guy, even though his origin story is a carpenter. And he made a bomb for his cracked hands as a carpenter, and his children help him turn it into a business. But he's still a carpenter walking around the business. He really is not a business guy. So he does the tours every morning, and he walks around, and he introduces people to the factory, and he talks to the employees. It's like having a grandfather around. It's really fun. His wife is more businessy, and his children are all working in the whole thing. Total family business. And so one of the things that they did is, because they care and they have children, is when mothers have babies, they can bring their babies to work for a long period of time. And it's part of the economic structure. It's just accepted. And there is a preschool built into the company. And now that might be costly, it might be inefficient, it might even be distracting. And he says, and I don't even know, I haven't measured it, and you know what, I don't think I should. But I'll tell you what, when I come down out of my cubicle or walking around and I see babies in here And I get a smile on my face. My heart explodes with so much love. I feel like I could work all day long, you know? I love these babies. I love these children. Why would I push them away somewhere else? Of course they should be here, you know? And everybody loves working there. He says it's, you know, people never leave. I have employees who are here for 16 years, 17 years, you know, working in all various parts of the company. There's almost no attrition. And that's not his only program. He hired a chef and they have a family meal at lunch. Long tables, organic food. The center place, you know, like the kind of the main, like kind of like a place like this. The kitchen is open to the whole thing and there's a chef in there cooking. And all the food is organic and local. And he says it's got to be sourced locally. And you come down for lunch and it's this incredible spread and it's, you know, you walk down the line and you get your food and then you sit at these long family tables and everybody stops working. No one's allowed to work during lunch. And they have 60 employees, so it's not a tiny business. But he's standing for something there. He says, this is important. If we lose our humanity, I don't know why I'm doing this. So Tom Wessels is recognizing him for integrating things the way nature would in terms of structure and mobility. And the more structure and mobility you have, the more diverse and resilient system you have. So he says a resilient system is comprised of highly differentiated parts, right? Not like a monocrop, that have the whole in mind. This is something to chew on for the next couple of years. And there's a little addition that's really important. Us with short feedback loops. Highly differentiated parts. So if we have a team, this is the way I design my leadership teams. And there'll be 8 different roles on this team with different functions. And they at once have a unique purpose on the team. You know, this person might be, like in an event like this, they're working the door like Lee. You know, it's a special function. It's called registration. You know, she's paying attention to logistics. She has like a whole job description around that. The rest of us aren't doing that job. You know, there's someone who's setting up chairs. It's called facilities, related to the manager, making sure there's water over there. Different job description. And they're different, right? But they also have a relationship to what's going on in the whole. So they're not just down in there doing their thing super efficiently. They're down and up, and then they're checking in. Okay, so how many people are coming? We're not here yet? Okay, I'm going to get a few more chairs. And so there's this balance between self and other, in a really good rhythm. And you can manage that on your teams. How often do you do that? Is it daily? Is it once a day? Is it once a week? Do you do retreats? How often do you do retreats? And what do you do when you're on them? Do you hike and party and, you know, hear a keynote from the CEO and then go get drunk that night? Like, what happens? What is the purpose of those retreats? A friend of mine tells me that a lot of them are horribly designed because they're not thinking about the overall health and well-being of the whole person. So those could be upgraded to being almost like that festival with the fish. You know, your company could be like that, where they come out with this surplus of like possibility and power and well-being and purpose after a retreat, where we wouldn't need to drink the cocaine water to self-medicate. We'd be happy with water, you know? So, you know, there's a role on the team who doesn't have a function. What their function is to keep awareness of the whole team. That's the big picture role. So you know everything's going well when the big picture person has nothing to do. Everything's going along smoothly. So this model here is the third thing that we integrate into our trainings and programs, which is, we call it the 8 archetypes model. And these 8 archetypes are actually based on observations in the natural world, different qualities that exist in the cycle of a day, in the cycle of the seasons, also in the intergenerational relationships, you know. So these different roles are actually based on, for example, sunrise, this role right here. And we know in the morning when the sun is rising, there's a certain quality to the day, especially if it was nighttime 2 seconds ago and cold all night long. You're at your coldest point. You're wondering if you're going to live or die, and then the sun comes up. Has anyone ever had that experience? Anyone get lost in the woods and be like, oh my God, I'm going to die? No? We used to do that for yeah, we used to do that for fun, you know, try to get lost and survive. But the cool thing is not the technical aspect of survival. The cool thing, turns out, is when the sun rises, because you're cold. And you realize, oh my God, this is what creation does every day. They make it through this period of stillness, darkness, cold, through a whole diversity of strategies. And now I'm in that with them. And I'm feeling something when that sun rises. I remember one particular survival trip that we did. It was really just kind of a camp out, but we didn't bring any tents or sleeping bags. We didn't bring any food. We had to gather our own water. We had to make our own fire. And we built this shelter out of the leaves that were on the ground as our insulation. We got really efficient with how we made it, you know, and the resources we had. We had to cooperate to build this huge thing. Got into some arguments because we were crabby. We had to peacemake with each other, work together, get through that. There's all these cool side benefits to the thing besides just struggling. But what was amazing is it wasn't kind of night you could sleep the whole night. It was like cold and ouchy and kind of anxious. And then in the dark, you start hearing the birds singing. And if it were robins, it would be like, and your heart starts pounding because you know what that means. It's right out of nothing. It's right out of silence. And you start like stiff and cold. My bones are resting on the ground. I come out of the shelter, push up the shelter door. There's this blue light on the horizon. And I'm thinking, oh, if we get up on that hill, we could get the sun as soon as possible, right up over there, you know. I'll get up there and we kind of just wait. It's just oranger and the glow gets more and more. And it's cold. It's like something Celsius. And, and frost is on the ground. But the birds are singing, and here comes the light, you know, and we look, and the trees are orange up there, you know, and it starts coming down the trees. And we turn, and it comes to us, and you can measurably feel the life-giving force of that ball of fire. It doesn't get any more holy than that. And so we want to sing, and so we start singing. Someone sings a song, something we can sing together. It's this most beautiful thing. So we have this experience of inspiration, of being alive. And so that, you could say, is like an archetypal moment. It happens in a number of areas of our life, like when a baby is born, like when a plant comes up above the ground and you're a gardener, or you got the little seed in the paper cup and it pops up above the soil. You can remember that feeling if you did that as a kid. It's like, oh my God. It's inspiring. Life goes on. Something's transforming here. So the archetype of this position here, we call it the east because where the sun rises. The east role is both inspiration and welcoming. They would be the one paying attention to the territorial acknowledgement or the greeting custom or what's happening as people are trying to make it from the door to this room with signs. They're paying attention to how welcome do people feel? How included are they? Is there jargon going on here that's confusing? Is there like, where's the bathroom? How can I help people orient and be here so they can connect? That's the east job function. And all we have to say is east, and people picture sunrise or, all those other qualities of the new day, spring. So the fact that these are based on nature is a really nice way of organizing systems, because they're flat at times and they're diverse. And these roles can interact with each other. I've used these in many, many training settings. You can also use these 8 archetypes to design a day or a week. You can organize a lot of things using this as your template, because they flow really nicely from one into the next in a natural rhythm. It's good before you get into the work of things, for example, to be inspired about why do the work. True or not true? But not everyone does that. You ever notice that? Sometimes we just go straight into the work.
Doesn't the work sometimes inspire you?
Yes, it can. Absolutely. But not always. I mean, work is hard. Why are we doing the work? So there must have been inspiration there somewhere. How did I get to the middle of the work? Is it just
You come to my office this morning, there was no inspiration going in, but inspiration leaving.
what happened?
The work worked out.
What's the workplace?
Building a table,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, pissed off, bored,
Uh-huh.
what the hell I'm doing, and then in the building process,
Yeah.
succeeding and coming out inspired
What was the purpose of the table?
for a client.
Okay. Was there
Custom furniture is what I do.
custom furniture? Was there a cool design to this that you're trying to work out, or
I mean, it was a puzzle that I beat, but the idea to me is that I went in totally just, I don't know why I do this, I don't know why,
Uh-huh.
and it was in the process itself that, the rebirth, the
Yes.
regeneration came with it all, right?
So why do you do this?
Well, that was something I could have asked you like half an hour ago as well, because, I fell into it. You earlier on you were sort of mentioning this concept as well, but I do it because it's something I fell into 5 years ago. I just trained in it, I started doing it, and now I'm doing it.
Yeah.
That's great. But there are days when I wonder what the hell I've been doing for the last 5 years, and there's some days when I realize that I've had the best luck of anyone in the room. But, that's a different story.
You got me curious.
There you go.
You got me curious. I'm on the edge of my seat. I want to know how people do that. I want to know how to go off trail and build a life that I'm congruent with, that my values are in alignment with what I do. That's called integrity. But there's something, I get a surplus from living that way. In the same way, I could say that if I'm not in alignment with my values, which happens naturally, I might just burn out on a certain stage of my life because I'm growing, and I no longer what I'm doing isn't fit anymore. If I stay there out of fear and I don't go into the initiatory transition and the unknown, it becomes actually a net loss. Anyone stay in a job too long or stay in a relationship too long because of fear of moving on? Nobody? Come on, tell the truth. There's a drain in the system, right? It's hard. It's hard to look at that, and it's hard to do that. I mean, it'd be cool to say, what did you do before the 5 years, right? There might have been a transition before that. But if you can get yourself into an environment where your personal gifts are being expressed in the world, that's a good clue. Because I have a belief, and I've seen it in other areas, that we're each born here with a special gift to bring to the world, a uniqueness, because that's how things work. There's a natural diversity here. The boxes may not fit you, and we were never taught you could make your own box. Custom furniture. What would that be like if we could be in a program called Culture that helps us foster our uniqueness and that it's wanted, and there's an expression for that? I know you're going through a journey right now of expressing yourself in a new way.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's crazy, right? You kind of have to there's a trade, actually. There's a little bit of trade, like sometimes you have to give up knowing who you are to pursue that, if that makes sense. Because the opposite is familiarity, and the familiarity might be an identity that you put on to survive, but it's not really who you are. If you look into the story of Carl Jung and Jungian work, there's an ego and an identity that helps us cope with the persona in the world, but it's not really our soul work. It's not why we're here. And that's okay. Sometimes you got to get those things online first. You know, I worked jobs to survive and figure out who I was, and it took me a while to catch up with myself. And depending on the fertility of my environment, people loving me, asking me questions, giving me opportunities, challenging me, you know, routines of connection, you know, then I start to evolve, and there's an emergence that takes place. Like, oh, I'm gifted at speaking, but not writing. I thought I was dumb because I was terrible at writing. Or I'm not really good at this. What is my gift? And other people actually pick up on it way quicker than you do. Like, I'm always the last to find out what my gift is. Anyone have that experience? It's kind of like you need other people to figure that out, to be in relationship with them. So there's a kind of vulnerability. So this is kind of the feedback loops part. So if you're interested, let's say if you're here and you're interested in evolving to here, whatever that means to you, like your life is not a match for you, or your lifestyle is not in a match with where we are on the planet right now, or your lifestyle is not in a match with the evolution of your children, because they'll send you on a journey. You might have to change your lifestyle because they're changing. Or your parents, if they're aging, can change your lifestyle. Because of relationship, we have to evolve. How do we foster the natural emergence so we're in right alignment with that? You know, this is, you could call this a spiritual journey, but I think in some ways it's natural if we can give it the proper care. Like watering a seed will grow. Feedback loops, in a cultural sense, could be considered mentoring, where you have a relationship with somebody of trust. Maybe they're a little further down the path than you. They look like they've been through some stuff and learned from it, and you respect them. So what would it be like if you went to them vulnerably and said, you know, I'm here, this is my story, I'm wondering if you would listen to this, because there's a chasm I have to cross, and I'm scared to death. Work, job, relationship, place, purpose. There's all sorts of chasms there. Can you help me with this? Can you hear my story and then reflect back to me what you're hearing about me? What do you think my gift is? I'm asking myself what my purpose is for being on the planet today. Ask the big questions, the kind of questions we give to teenagers when they go out on solo. And make your life into a kind of quest. And what starts to happen is it becomes like an awakening, because there's diversity in your life now. There's inquiry, there's curiosity. It's kind of beckoning the response, like a call and response. And the other word that gets used a lot in system thinking is self-organization. Self-organizing, meaning it adjusts itself. And Margaret Wheatley introduced me to the idea that self-organization has a lot to do with identity, reorganizing yourself. So that's why when you go on this journey, you somehow have to trade how you've known yourself for the evolution of where you're going. And that's why it's scary, because most of our attachment, in my experience, is familiarity of who I am, even if it's not really who I am. It's how I've done it. So I could live a whole life that's flat, maybe a net loss, maybe a net loss to the people around me. Maybe I complain a lot. Maybe I'm dragging my feet in the system, like, well, this is what it is, you know. But I like it. I like to nourish on the negative. You know, I kind of like to irritate the canker sore in my mouth. Keep going back to it, making it worse. But to make this step in this direction, you could describe it as heroic. It's adventurous. It's why we love movies. And I think we have a kind of, you know, opportunity with movies, like the two choices of water. Do we just go to the movies and do the morphine water and then go back to our life? It kind of fed us temporarily. Like, oh yeah, that was heroic. That got my heart beating. It was so exciting when he leaped across that chasm, right? Oh my gosh, the rescue was amazing. Wow, they saved it just in the last nick of time. You know? Hero runs out of the ball of flames. At the very end, the car explodes and rolls over. The big thing in Star Wars explodes. It's like the same ending every time. Just barely made it. But I think it's mythic for us because we all have a relationship to that. There's There's this want for that in our life. It doesn't have to be so epic, but that's how it lives in us. Like, it would be so epic if I took that step into more of who I am. It would be like that in the movies. But I think if we lived like that, we'd be fine drinking the regular water because our life would be heroic. Does that make sense? So that's what I'm hoping to ignite here. Not just whole businesses and healthier businesses. I'm hoping to ignite a larger transformation that sees an alignment between self, family, business, and nature. That nature and culture and business and people are all one. Not like we're all one, but they're in alignment. They operate that way. We design for that. And we do that by bringing the gift from the margins back into the center. Ways of being that are ancient. Processes of connection. Core routines of awareness that foster emergence and self-organization. And you get something like the journey of a caterpillar who's going on this growth journey and then puts this little piece of glue underneath a stick and somehow does this little magic coat over itself. Stitches it up with beautiful golden beads on the side. For art, I guess. And then, in that moment, becomes liquid. Liquid. That's what happens biologically. Soup. There's no forecast of butterflies coming. Nope. You don't get it that way. You don't get something for nothing. Got to go soup first, then butterfly. And we're biology too, right? Our human development is like that. We don't really kind of get to know. We kind of have to take that step into that direction. So I consider that a high leverage point story, because if we all move in that direction and we cultivate our gifts as we're supposed to express them in the world, we can have some power being in alignment, being like nature, like humans are, nature, right? And there's cultural patterns to draw from. There's ways of doing this. So, I've been doing this for 20 years in one context. I'm just increasing the context a little bit further so that we can foster the emergence of something beautiful. A natural evolution that takes all of this into account. Who's on board? Would you do that with me? It's risky being up here, I want you to come along in your own way and in your own time. But if you're interested and you're here for a reason, there's pathways for that. There's stories for that. There's tools you can practice tomorrow. For example, in here, this is a good one. One of the 13 core routines of awareness that we work with is gratitude. On the margins, it's all over the place. You can find it all over the world in every culture and tradition. As you move towards the center, I'm going to go to Google in a couple weeks. I'm just pretty sure they're not doing gratitude in the morning when they get started on their day, or at lunch break, or at any point in their day. Why? Why not? What would that be like? To introduce a moment of thankfulness. Not religious, but like connecting. What do you think? So you can take that home and consider, where in my life do I express gratitude and with who? And notice, how do you feel when you participate in that? So for example, call out some words for me. How do you feel when you're thankful?
Warm.
Warm? You mean like the room's warm? I'm just hot. Sorry. Yeah, heart. Okay, something in your heart. What else when you feel thankful? Connected? Gracious. Humble. Lucky. Happy. Open. Joyful. Blessed. Excited. Conductor. And what was that? What? Creative. Creative. Peaceful. Alive. Inspired. I asked this company today, I said, is there any reason we wouldn't want any of those things at work? I mean, which one of those don't we want at work? And they were silent, just like you. Like, I can't think of one reason why we wouldn't want all those things at work. Okay, cool. Let's consider that possibility of bringing these two things together. Cultural elements that create connection, you know? Inspiration, gratitude, joy, relationship, humility. Bring our whole selves to work, our whole human being. Okay, I'm gonna have to stop there. Is it time to stop already?
Yep.
Thank you for listening.